So, the top 5 tank monster sets. This is including next patch, just so you know, because we've got a couple of new monster sets coming out. So I just wanted to go over what my top 5 is kind of looking like maybe for next patch. There are a few little changes to what it might have been. So we're going to start with number 5. And this set is kind of, I mean, this one's a little bit situational, but it's a good set nonetheless. So here we go. Number 5 is Baron. Now, the reason I've got this set on the list is because when you're using a brittle setup or like an elemental catalyst setup, depending on how you're running it, this monster set can be really, really good for the ulti gain. Now, it is actually quite difficult to micromanage this set if you're not running a brittle setup, if you're not running an elemental catalyst setup, because you don't have enough effects to get the stacks to proc it to get the kind of ultimate gain. So it does require a bit of effort. It does require you to run kind of a specific setup, but it's a really, really good option to include. Now, the reason it's on the list is because ultimate gain for a tank is extremely important. And I think if you're not somebody who is like very good at maintaining Pearls of Elnathay, for example, this can be a really good option. Yeah, so this is a really good set for that situation. And some people, like Pearls of Elnathay is a really good mythic item for an off tank especially, but it's very, very difficult to micromanage it. From my own experience, I feel like it's not something that the majority of players can do. It's really like elite tier level that are good with that that mythic item. And this is a good alternative though, because this is a good setup to run with a kind of those brittle setups and things that a lot of people are trying to work in, and they are very important. So number 5 for me is the Baron monster set. So number 4, Engine Guardian. Now, the reason this is on the list is because obviously we're not talking about like tank meta. This is not about tank meta. We're talking about the top 5 sets for a tank. That is a broad thing to answer the question for, because obviously there's more tanks in this game that are at beginner level and progressive level than there are at elite level best team in the game, because there's a very few people at that level. So obviously we're not going to include everything that's just about meta. So when it comes to a sustain set, this is the absolute best set in the game, especially from like a tank perspective. So the One Piece isn't that really that useful, like health recovery. It's okay. It's not vital. It's not super important, but it is kind of a little bit extra, something that we can make a little bit of use out of as a tank. The main thing is when you use an ability. Now it's just any ability. You've got a 25% chance to summon the Dwemer to restore stamina, magicka, or health every half a second for 6 seconds, and that procs once every 10 seconds. This is something that is pretty much there for a whole fight. It feels like it's always active. It procs so easily. And it does work better on some classes more than others. So a Dragon Knight will find more benefit from this gear set than certain other classes. A Sork tank would provide more benefit from this as well. Other classes wouldn't get as much benefit, but it's still the absolute best. And yeah, like this is the only sustain set, in my opinion, that is really worth running. There are other good sustain sets, like you've kind of got Grundwolf, which is alright. Grundwolf's quite nice, because that just gives you stamina and magicka. It's a guarantee. When it procs, it gives you stamina and magicka, but it's a very small amount, and you have to crit to benefit from that as well. Now the problem is, it's difficult to crit as a tank. Even though you will crit, because you're doing a lot of attacks, like you're taunting, heroic slash, blockades down, ticking away. So it is going to proc, but sometimes it's not going to proc on cooldown. So that's a bit of an issue in my opinion from using Grundwolf, is that it won't proc on cooldown, because you can't guarantee that when it's off cooldown that it's going to proc straight away, because there's no guarantee you're even going to do a crit damage hit. So that's why Engine Guardian is so good, is because it's fantastic for beginners. If you need anything sustain-wise, use Engine Guardian. If you're struggling for any resources, use Engine Guardian. It's absolutely fine to use this instead of something else that's more damage-orientated, purely because if you can sustain and you can survive, then obviously you're going to do a better job of tanking. As I said about it being really good on a DK, this is a question I got asked earlier in the week. But for a DK tank, for example, if the heal procs from Engine Guardian, when the heal is ticking from the Engine Guardian set, you can cast Balance. When that happens, you're gaining Magicka back. So if it's giving you, and then if that's happening, obviously you're not. If you're at full health, there's no point in just leaving Engine Guardian to tick while you're on full health because it's not giving you anything. It's just it's a wasted proc. But if you start casting Balance while it's healing you, you're benefiting from the heal that you're guaranteed that you're going to get from Engine Guardian. So it's a really nice way to convert that heal into Magicka. And you can do that on any class. It doesn't have to be a Dragon Knight, any class. Now, the reason why the Dragon Knight benefits from this a little bit more than every other class is purely because if you get, well, if that happens, if you get the health proc or the Magicka proc, you can spam Igneous Shield, you can get Magicka, you can convert your Magicka into stamina. So if you are using this gear set and it's giving you health, you convert your health into Magicka with Balance, and then you convert your Magicka into stamina with Igneous Shield. So you just spam Igneous Shield, and obviously you've got your passive in there that gives you 990 stamina every time you use Igneous Shield. So no matter what, if you're using Engine Guardian on a Dragon Knight tank, you should have no sustain issues no matter what the content, because you can just rotate different abilities to give yourself different resources depending on the situation. So it's fantastic. Other classes are going to be finding this really good as well. Like I say, all tanks have more Magicka skills than stamina skills. They have more of those more than anything. So having more Magicka incoming is great. If you've got health coming in, you can convert that to Magicka. If you get stamina, that's what we want. The stamina procs are really important, especially for other classes. So that's going to help you with your stamina sustain. Now, you shouldn't need the stamina proc every single time to justify using it, because you should be able to sustain a little bit, and this should just help. This shouldn't be the only thing that you're doing to sustain your character. So if you are using this and it's your only way of sustaining, you're not heavy attacking, you're perma blocking, you're not using sturdy gear, you're not doing all the other things that you need to sustain, this ain't going to help you. You need to be able to do other things as well to help you sustain, and this just really tops it off to give you that real good level of comfort. I'm going to say that it was kind of difficult to pick 5. It was difficult to pick a top 5 because there are some other gear sets that I really like in terms of monster sets. Like, there's going to be 2 definitely that I want to talk about when we finish, that like notable mentions, because they are good, but they just didn't make the list because it's only a top 5. But my number 3 gear set is something you might not have seen yet. It's the Magma Incarnate set. Hear me out with this one. So this one's not going to be like a meta monster set. It's not, because I feel like this is going to be a good situational monster set for dungeon content. If you're trying to like organize a group for dungeon content, I'm looking at this gear set and seeing things like the Minor Courage is in there. But for dungeons, right, what this means is now you can drop Yolnahkrin for dungeon content, potentially. And what you can do is, let's say you're in a 3DD 1-tank group. You can use PA, Olorim, and Magma Incarnate to get Major Courage, Minor Courage, and PA all into one. That just seems too good to miss out on that opportunity. So people need to kind of test it out and try and figure it out and get it into their builds and stuff. But in my opinion, just from like the initial, just initially trying this out and seeing it, Magma Incarnate I do think is going to be one of the higher end sets in terms of 4-man content. Just because it means then there's no use for Yolnahkrin really. You can take Yolnahkrin out and add another gear set in. In terms of my own build, I'd like to run a heavy set for dungeon content personally. Some people like to use PA, and I can appreciate that. And I used to like using PA as well on the body, and I still do sometimes. But I do kind of like having the comfort there with some of the harder DLC dungeons, especially the hard modes and stuff. I do like that level of comfort by wearing heavy. So for my personal setup, it's probably going to look like something like Drake's Rush, PA, and Magma. Quite often we have like a healer or a hybrid healer who's going to do like Spell Power Cure with Master Architect or something like that. So every group's different. Every group's going to work this in different ways. So this might not work for you. But when you also compare the gain of Minor Courage versus something like Kratos. Now, if you're in a Magicka-based dungeon group, Kratos is a very, very tiny, tiny buff. The reason Kratos is so popular and so mass used right now is purely down to the fact that there's nothing else that provides a damage buff. You could argue that things like Symphony of Blades provides a damage buff. If you're in a 3DD 1-tank dungeon group, Symphony of Blades is kind of a DPS gain, because if your DDs have to heavy attack at any point in a fight, that's a loss of DPS. So if you're using Symphony of Blades and then they never have to do a heavy attack, that's a DPS gain. But in terms of like a direct DPS increase, you're going to get it from using this particular monster set. And this is more DPS than in Kratos. Because in Kratos, from what I've seen and tested myself, is people are only really gaining 500 more damage per second, up to 1,000 damage per second. Like, that's barely even 1% of a DPS increase. Magma Incarnate provides minor courage. It is on a bit of a cooldown. It's got a 5-second cooldown, so it's not 100% uptime. But it is still going to provide more than around a 1%. This is going to be more than a 1% DPS increase. So, for 4-man content, I think you've got to start looking at this and definitely try out. This is coming out next patch on the Waking Flame patch. So, that is my number 3. And like I say, it's just for 4-man content. You are not going to use this in trial content. Let me just make that really, really clear. It's not for trial content. It's not going to be useful because it's got a limit on the amount of people. It's got a cooldown. Yolnahkrin is 100% uptime. So you're not going to replace Yolnahkrin with this monster set for 12 people content. So there isn't really a... Well, I'm just going to go with it. So my number 2 is Tremor Scale. Tremor Scale... It's tricky because it is like the best monster set in the game if you're in a stamina group. If you're not in a stamina group, obviously it's the worst monster set in the game because it's doing nothing. So it's a tricky situation, but I wanted to put this on my list because a lot of people I see wearing Tremor Scale in Magicka groups. And I don't think people realise that actually this is only for stamina groups. People need to understand this. It will reduce the physical resistance only, of an enemy by 2,395. That's only physical. It's not spell resistant. It doesn't reduce the spell resistance of an enemy. So what that means is if you use this in a Magicka group, they're going to get 0 benefit. So this is essential for stamina DPS because they are so far under the pen cap because they don't have the light armor passives that they need more pen. The way that you achieve more pen is something consistent like Tremor Scale. So this is a consistent monster. It procs every 8 seconds. That's kind of maybe an annoying thing because it's an 8-second duration. It can be procs every 8 seconds. But at the same time, your taunt lasts for 15. So you've got to keep casting taunt to keep proccing it. You've got to remember to do that. So there can be some poor uptime situations there because of that. If you remember to use it and you're actively using it, then that's great. No one's really got as much of an excuse anymore just because obviously you can see now your ability timers on console, on PC, whatever, it doesn't matter. You can see your ability timers now. So you can be looking at your taunt timer and making sure that it's like been 8 seconds and then recast it again. So everybody can do that now. There's not really an excuse of, oh yeah, PC have got add-ons or console doesn't have add-ons. Everybody can keep 100% uptime of Tremor Scale now because of the ability timers. You can just track it via your taunt. So yeah, this is my number 2, Tremor Scale. And it's a very good monster set. It's only really super good for stamina groups. If you're in a Magicka group, do not use it. It's not going to be worth using in a Magicka group whatsoever. Okay, before we talk about the number 1 monster set, so there is a few that I did want to mention. So just because I haven't listed some on this list, it doesn't mean that they're not good. So let's just say something like Lord Warden, for example. That can be a good monster set to have for certain situations. It's too situational. The only single one time that I use that is doing the trench strat in VHOF when the group's all on the track, all stacked up, and people are dying to the stomp. Put in Lord Warden, people survive. So specific situations where you're in group, taking hits to proc it, it can be good to use it to increase your group's resistances, especially stamina groups and things like that can be really, really good. That's why it's not that useful anymore, because there is no stamina groups, people play at range, not as useful. So Lord Warden is a good set in that situation. Another one, Bloodspawn. If you're not very good at maintaining Baron, if you're not very good at maintaining Pearls, Bloodspawn is another option. But as an off-tank, if you're not taking hits regular enough to proc it, then obviously it's not worth using. The main tank wouldn't usually use something like Bloodspawn because you're going to be prioritizing something else. So Bloodspawn is a good one, but obviously it's only got a 6% chance to proc that gear set. So it can be a little bit awkward to use, especially if you're trying to replace something like Pearls, replace Baron, and then you're going to use Bloodspawn. With Baron, it relies on you to proc it. It's 100% up to you to proc it with your skills and abilities. With the Bloodspawn set, you're relying on taking hits and damage. So it's out of your control whether it procs or not, and that's why I've not included it in my top 5. And then the last thing is like healing monster sets. Healing monster sets are very, very like underperforming from what I've seen and how, like, when upon using them myself, Earthgore as a set, not as good now. It's lost about 10k worth of healing this patch. Like, Earthgore is 10k healing less effective. So I don't like it as much just because it used to be 10k better. I don't like Troll King for anything other than Cloud Rest. So if you're going into Cloud Rest and you're going into the portals, or you're going to be the Execute main tank, then Troll King is fantastic. But outside of that situation, it's not a really good, reliable monster set for healing, if we're being honest. Another one is Malabeth, the Scourge Harvester monster set. A good one again. Situational. I like to use it in Kind's Aegis, but it's not super, super effective 100% of the time. So those 3 healing monster sets are things that you can use in different environments and situations if you need it. But none of them are really, really amazing performers that it's worth saying, right, you've got to run this healing monster set because this one's the best. Like I say, Troll King works the best in Cloud Rest. Malabeth works the best in Kind's Aegis. And then Earthgore can be useful if you're in a really stationary fight and you need some extra healing. But you shouldn't really... It shouldn't be essential to need that. But if you do, that's your option. And then my number 1 tank monster set going into next patch is going to be in Kratos. Obviously, there's no change to this. The reason why this is useful, and like I said before, this is the only monster set for a Magicka group that is going to increase DPS. If you're doing trials or dungeons or any content, you can use this monster set. It's providing DPS increase. There are no other monster sets that do that, so that's why this is most useful. It's really easy to maintain. Fire enchant on your weapon, or a flame ability. So most people would be better with the flame glyph, because if you've got to keep another ability active, that might be a struggle for some players. But if you're just going to proc in Kratos with your taunt every time, then obviously that's going to be good enough. But yeah, in Kratos is number 1. It's the only thing that's providing that buff. And it's also kind of good as well for the actual damage reduction. It reduces damage taken by people stood inside it. So things like, when you think about like the Vass Execute, if you've got your off tank using this in Execute on Asylum Sanctorium, there's fire damage. If people are stood inside it, they're going to get less fire damage. In VHOF, on like the triplets and stuff, there's quite a bit of fire damage in there sometimes. If people are stood inside it, obviously you're going to reduce the damage they're taking. So it can work in good ways with things like that. You can put it on a healer for the Yolnahkrim fight in VSS to reduce some of the fire damage. There's loads of different ways to use in Kratos, but in Kratos, for Dragon Knights, provides around about a 3k DPS increase, which is really nice. Not many people play Magicka DKs, but for your general Magicka players, everybody uses flame staffs, flame glyphs, some flame abilities. It's worth using because it will provide somewhere between 500 to 1k DPS increase. So damage per second is increased by about 1k. Best situation. So there you go. That is my number 1 tank monster set. So guys, that is my top 5 tank monster sets going into next patch, the Waking Flame patch. And as I say, there are some other good monster sets, don't get me wrong, but these ones are the best performing ones and the ones that will help the mass majority of the community in like every situation. So there we go.